Most of these aquatic biota, let's take crustaceans for example, we say that they are resident fauna or resident invertebrates in the systems because they lay those dormant eggs that then hatch out. They are quite capable of hatching out and reproducing within the space of 2 to 3 weeks. If we shorten that hydra period or that flood cycle, or that flood doesn't occur, then what happens is we reduce the ability for those organisms to hatch out, mature, and replenish the eggs in the sediment. So effectively what we're doing is reducing the egg or the seed bank within the lake bed, and that means that the ecological values of that system may be impacted or diminished.
All right. On Tell Us All About It today, we're joined by someone who helps us understand some of the most extraordinary and misunderstood ecosystems on the planet, salt lakes. Fiona Toukoulis is the business leader for the WA Environment team at Stantec, having previously held the roles of ecology lead and aquatic and subterranean ecology lead. She has a PhD in environmental biology with over 25 years' experience in environmental consulting and academia, having joined the legendary Outback Ecology in 2005 before becoming part of MWH and now Stantec. In today's episode, Fiona will take us on a journey into the world of salt lakes, how they form, what makes them so unique, and why they matter and what they can teach us about environmental change. So settle in. We're about to dive into the shimmering, salty, surprising realm of one of Earth's most fascinating ecosystems with Dr. Fiona Toukoulis. Hi, Fiona.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So, for listeners who might not be familiar, can you paint us a picture of what a Western Australian salt lake actually looks like and what makes these places so unique?
Yeah, sure. So most of our salt lakes in WA are large, open areas of muddy or clay substrate. They appear quite barren from the onset. They are typically dry. However, they do flood. That would be what most of you might be aware of as the boom phase when they get rainfall, and they are very productive, and that's what makes them so unique. So we have salt lakes right through from the wheat belt into the goldfields and arid interior regions of WA. Typically they get larger as you move through into the more arid and remote areas. Often as well they will flood at different times. So usually in the wheat belt it might be more winter and spring rainfalls that causes flooding. As you get more inland, it might be those wet periods associated with ex-tropical low systems that come down from the north.
Okay. So they're unique in a lot of ways. What first drew you into studying the systems, and was there a particular moment or a discovery or a lake itself that hooked you in?
Probably, to be honest, it was cold hard cash as a poor student. As an honours student, I was offered a scholarship to study salt lakes with my supervisor, the late Jacob John. And from there, I got out into the wheat belt in flood, and these systems had me since then. Very unique, nothing quite like a salt lake in flood with the sun glinting off the water. Give a beach a run for its money any day in flood.
So these environments seem so very hostile, and I know when I was first sort of coming out and into the world of environmental regulation, environmental management, they were typically a place that mining proponents could dump all of their water. But they're contrary to that belief. I guess they're full of life. What kind of organisms are you seeing out there, and what are the true heroes of the salt lakes in WA?
Yeah, so I'm an algologist by trade, studied diatoms for my PhD, so I'm always going to say that the true heroes are the algae. So you might see on a salt lake that they are full of life in terms of lots of aquatic invertebrates, Parartemia or brine shrimp that people would know as sea monkeys, lots of those shield shrimps which have a very unique shield and tail. People would be aware of those aquatic invertebrates as well. However, these systems are all driven by primary producers. Algae, if you were to scrape back some of the sediment on a lake that's inundated, you would find quite a thick algal mat that drives the productivity of most salt lakes. That in turn provides a food source for our aquatic invertebrates, and that is what draws or attracts water birds to these systems when they're in flood.
And is it only when they're in flood that you see a sort of proliferation of life?
Yes, so good question. So these salt lake systems will support some algae. As I mentioned, my background is diatoms. Diatoms actually have a siliceous cell wall. That means that they can persist in moist lake sediments, which salt lakes contain. So they can survive in those conditions, in dry conditions, but salt lakes also support what is called resting stages, and that is the dormant propagules, eggs and spores and seeds of algae, macrophytes or aquatic plants, and also aquatic invertebrates. Those eggs and spores are capable of being desiccation resistant and can survive long periods of drought, waiting in between those major flood events in salt lakes.
So even in sort of the extreme salinities you get out there, you get a lot of life that's just waiting for those flood events.
Yeah, that's correct. Comes across as very hostile environments, but these aquatic biota are well suited to these conditions.
And do you find that the plants and animals that potentially grow in these systems also come back during those times of flood, or do they stick around during the times of drought, or do they recolonize once the flood comes through?
Yep, so most of the aquatic biota in salt lakes lay dormant in the lake bed, in the sediment there. Then when you get some rainfall, they start to emerge, so they'll hatch and they'll germinate out during those first rains, which are basically a cue for them to emerge. It's that low salinity phase, which tells everything, righto, it's time to get going, and we need to hatch and emerge, and we need to have a really fast life cycle so that we can complete that life cycle and then drop our eggs and spores and seeds for the next flood event.
And I'm imagining there's probably a number of species that are only found in Western Australian salt lakes. What makes them special?
Yeah, so salt lakes do contain organisms that you would typically find in freshwater systems. It's just that the actual species themselves vary because they are adapted to the higher salinities. However, we do have several restricted species that we know from some salt lakes. Lake Kerry is a good example, or we have a species of Parartemia bicorna, that's only known from Lake Kerry. However, the proviso on a lot of these species, including ostracods as well, is that we may not have looked at some of the lake systems or the saline peripheral wetlands around them, and they may be better distributed. It's just that these systems are very remote and difficult to get to.
So I know your background is obviously around the diatoms, the phytoplankton and things like that. Can you give us an idea of what controls how salty a salt lake gets? Is it a rainfall, groundwater geology, or something else? Is it a number of factors?
Yep, so it's basically all of those factors.
Okay.
So the way these systems have formed is that rainfall picks up salts in seawater and then drops it over the land over a geological time period. Over time, those salts build up, and then salt lakes, being the low point in the landscape, will accumulate those salts. You also get runoff from the surrounding catchment, which increases salt loads naturally over time.
You mentioned some of the species are very well adapted to hypersaline conditions. Have there been any studies that have looked at how saline the conditions can get before that adaptation disappears?
Yeah, so most salt lakes will go through, as I said, a boom and then a bust cycle as the system starts to dry out. Now, they need a low salinity phase to hatch, but then they can persist, some species, well into very hypersaline conditions. So we're talking over 100,000, 150,000 milligrams per litre. Some species over 200,000 milligrams per litre TDS. Saturation point in salt lakes typically occurs at around 300 to 330,000 milligrams per litre TDS. Most species start to drop off around the 150,000 milligrams per litre. That's usually their upper limit.
And I'm imagining as well, you've got salt lakes in different parts of Western Australia, from the wheat belt, as you mentioned, down through to the goldfields. How different are these systems, or do they all function in a very similar way?
Shorter answer is they're all very different. They all have very different geomorphological features. They all have different water quality. A lot of them have different sediment composition. They have different surrounding geological features and catchments. even within the same salt lake system, we've been sampling Lake Kerry, for example, for over 20 years now. And every time there's a flood, the conditions are different. So even within the same salt lake, they can have different conditions.
That probably lends itself nicely to sort of explaining some of the surprising processes that are going on within these salt lakes. On the basis of what you've just said, does that imply that every time you go out, you're looking at something different and something surprising?
Again, probably the short answer is yes, depending on the nature of that flood, the rainfall. Obviously, some of these systems are extremely large, so rainfall can be highly variable, which means different parts of the lake may flood in its entirety. All of the different types of aquatic biota respond differently and have different tolerance limits to water quality. So it's the algae that will drive the different types of productivity that we'll see, from algae through to aquatic plants, and then that will drive the aquatic invertebrate assemblage, and then water birds. The longer a system is inundated, the more likelihood you will get water birds, including migratory birds, visiting these systems and potentially breeding if they're inundated for several months.
So what are the biggest pressures then that they're facing today, given all of those different variables that you've talked about? How can you assess those? How can you consider those if they're constantly changing and no two seasons are necessarily the same?
Yep, good question. So pressures, particularly in the wheat belt, everyone would be aware that fairing is a major pressure, which has led to secondary salinisation, which is where the water table has risen and saline water drains off into these salt lakes. So that is increasing the salinity of some of these systems artificially. Similarly, mining, and we touched on it in the intro. My background is dewatering discharge, where mines will often put their excess mine water into salt lakes. Again, that comes with additional salt loads. So we are increasing quite rapidly in some instances the rate of salinisation of these systems, and they are the key threats. Coming back to your question about the organisms, most of these organisms can tolerate some level of salinity, as we said, sort of above 150,000 milligrams per litre in some instances. It's really that low salinity phase that we need to protect, where the emergence happens.
Okay. And you mentioned sort of those changes in salinity. We're obviously in a drying climate. What shifts or changes are you expecting to see with respect to salt lake ecology in that drying climate, where we get less rainfall, obviously less wetting cycles, but much more evaporation and much quicker evaporation, which would presumably lead to a much greater salinity within these systems?
Yeah, so what typically happens is most of these aquatic biota, let's take crustaceans for example, we say that they are resident fauna or resident invertebrates in the systems because they lay those dormant eggs that then hatch out. They are quite capable of hatching out and reproducing within the space of 2 to 3 weeks. If we shorten that hydro period or that flood cycle, or that flood doesn't occur, then what happens is we reduce the ability for those organisms to hatch out, mature, and replenish the eggs in the sediment. So effectively what we're doing is reducing the egg or the seed bank within the lake bed, and that means that the ecological values of that system may be impacted or diminished.
And I guess the flow-on question from that is, what are
Pun intended?
What are the implications of that? I mean, again, people would sort of say, well, they're isolated systems. If we lose the biota within that, is there a problem?
Yeah, another really good question. So we sort of discussed earlier that some of these lake systems support quite unique species. That includes, when they're in a major flood event, water birds that include migratory species that are coming from the northern hemisphere. Now, if we lose that ecological productivity, we are losing biodiversity within Western Australia, and salt lakes are some of our most unique areas supporting biodiversity in the state.
Okay. So taking all that into consideration, how do you actually go and study these lakes, and what have you used in the past? What are you using now? And what have you found to be most effective?
Yeah, so obviously we know that they are predominantly dry, and we do need to consider that in terms of how we're trying to assess or sample salt lakes. With aquatic systems in general, and particularly inland systems, I'm a big advocate of looking at the entire system. That means the hydrological regime, abiotic factors like water and sediment, and then the ecological, biological components, everything from algae through to water birds. So in dry conditions, we don't have that, but we can analyse the sediment and look at the chemistry of the sediment. We can also collect that sediment and artificially flood it back in the laboratory and see what hatches out as a guide. We can't replicate flood conditions in their entirety, but we can get a guide or get an indication of what the diversity is in the laboratory under controlled conditions.
What about techniques such as remote sensing, aerial drone imagery, and other things like that? Has that changed your approach to dealing with sampling and assessment?
Yes, recently we have been looking at historic satellite imagery and extracting the data that sits behind that to understand the hydrological regime. So some of that imagery might go back to the 80s, and we can pull out the data that sits behind that imagery and then look at how much area of the lake is covered in water for how often, so the duration and the surface extent of those floodwaters. And that's really critical to understand how important a lake might be, for example, for breeding water birds.
And is that changing? Are you seeing any changes within that sort of wetting, drying cycle over the last, 50 years?
Yep, so it really depends on the area. So, for example, recently we were working on Lake Mackay, which is the fourth largest salt lake in Australia, the biggest in Western Australia. What we found is because that sits further north on the border of the Northern Territory and WA, is in the years prior to 2000, there was really only, I think, 3 or 4 major or complete flood events. Post-2000, what the aerial imagery showed us was that the area was subject to more frequent large storm events, and we saw that hydrological regime increase where major floods were hitting the area probably on average 3 to 5 years. So that's different to probably what we see in the wheat belt and the goldfields areas where we might be subject to a more drying climate.
And a bit of a question without notice. If you're getting a flood event, does that inherently mean that your the biological values, the phytoplankton and algae and everything else, do they flow downstream? So do they colonise other lakes as one lake floods and spills over into the next lake?
Yeah, so in the wheat belt, for example, if you fly over that area, you can see very clearly chains of salt lakes that are connected. In major flood events, the answer to your question is yes, they will connect up. Similarly, if you've got areas of connectivity like tributaries or streams and rivers that are flowing between systems, you've got an ability for those propagules to move between lake systems. Typically in the larger systems in the goldfields and then further north or inland, they're large discrete systems, so there may not be as much opportunity for that transfer or changing and shifting of those propagules between the systems.
But in a drying climate, you're losing not only the biological values of the lake itself, but potentially the biological values of the downstream lake if you're not getting that flooding event.
Yes, correct. Or the ability for those propagules to move between systems. Yes.
Okay. So what are some of the more exciting or unexpected discoveries that either your research or other people's research has uncovered with respect to salt lakes?
Yeah, so I guess we've been quite lucky to make several new finds of new species in some of these systems, which has been really great to be part of. There's also other scientists out there doing some great work like Angus Laurie, who's at Curtin, who's using DNA or genetic analysis to look at the biodiversity of these salt lake systems. So it's in its infancy. We need to first get a library of that genetic material of the species that are there before we can start looking at the broader communities. But I think taxonomists are rare.
Yes. Yeah.
As rare as some of the species we find on these lakes, particularly when it comes to algae and certain groups of aquatic invertebrates. So DNA gives us an opportunity to look at different sampling methods to assess these lakes.
And are you finding that the more you go out, the more new species you find?
Yes, particularly in the early stages of flood, because at that low salinity phase, you have a really broad group of organisms that can inhabit those salinities. As it gets higher in salinity, it's usually the same species and we know what they are. That lower salinity phase is the one where we find.
Do you get to name the species after yourself?
Not as yet.
Yeah.
So if anyone's listening and would like to name one after me, please do.
I thought if you found something, you get to name it.
No, typically you name it after someone else or
Right.
something that has been inspiring for you.
Well, that wouldn't be me, but anyway, let's
We can keep you in mind.
keep us in mind for the next one. Big knowledge gaps. I mean, it's a huge area, and obviously you sort of say every single time you go out, there's something new or something that changes. What do you or what do we as scientists and environmental professionals still have to learn about with respect to salt lakes?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of areas that are still yet to be studied. I think fundamentally it's the hydrological system regime and also water quality that drives these systems. So understanding that is the basics, the basic drivers, or as the basic drivers for these systems is critical. And I think we're still working out ways to do that effectively in such remote areas. I also think that, as I said, the taxonomy is problematic for key groups of aquatic invertebrates. And algologists, we've got very few specialists in that field throughout the entirety of Australia. So there's some knowledge gaps that scientists can jump in and help address.
I did phytoplankton succession, the Swan River, for my thesis when I did my engineering degree. So, but I wasn't very good at it, and it was a mathematical models of the growth and decay of various species in the swan. So I have an appreciation of how difficult all of that is.
Yeah.
Coming back to one of my earlier questions, the approvals process for mining and I guess dewatering and other industries that exist on salt lakes. Potash industry is a classic example of something that really chews up a lot of the area on salt lakes. How do you go about dealing with the approvals process? Are you happy with the way it works from a salt lake perspective? Have we learned things? Have we changed how we deal with salt lakes from an EIA perspective, say?
I think the regulators are definitely more aware, and I think we have all, increased our knowledge and understanding of salt lakes as time has gone on. I think the Part 5 approvals for dewatering discharge are quite good, quite rigorous, because it involves a quantitative risk assessment.
Mm-hmm.
I also think the fundamental objective of the Part 4 approvals under inland waters of maintaining hydrological processes and water quality to conserve biological values is also spot on. However, where I think we've got some work to do is in the inland waters guidance. It's not as prescriptive as, say, flora or fauna. It means that it's open to interpretation. It means that proponents may engage different consultants, for example, with different levels of knowledge, and you end up with, a non-standardised approach to what is presented for the inland waters chapter in approvals, which I presume, from a regulator's perspective, makes it quite difficult to assess. Mm. I also think we need to get better on the interpretation side of bringing together the hydrology and the ecology and understanding the relationship between those processes so that we can have, a more accurate impact assessment.
But if you, coming back to something you said earlier, if you're seeing new things every time you go out, and you mentioned Lake Carey as an example, different flooding events bring different, presumably different species, different biological changes to the lake. How can we ever be comfortable with something that's artificially changing a lake system if we don't know what's there?
I think as long as we understand the variation in water quality and the hydrological regime, as long as we are maintaining those two fundamental aspects of these systems, obviously they're extremely variable. As long as we can maintain those fundamentals, we should be maintaining biodiversity.
Okay. The Indigenous side of things is always fascinating, and I confess I don't know enough about Indigenous knowledge with respect to the environment. Is that something you look at, and does Indigenous knowledge shape your understanding of Salt Lake and landscapes?
Yeah, I think I've worked with traditional owners in the past, and I think the knowledge that they have and the understanding, particularly of where a lake might flood, when it has flooded in the past, has been really valuable so that we can target some of those areas for sampling. I think one of the key things to remember about these systems is they are so large that not all of that area will flood in one go. However, there are some parts of the lake that might flood regularly, and traditional owners have been really valuable with the knowledge they bring to the table on that understanding. They also have been really interested in the science, so that two-way knowledge sharing piece, integrating cultural and scientific knowledge is critical, I think, to management.
Is there a mythological aspect to all of that with respect to salt lakes that you're aware of?
Yes, we have been told that there's some of those aspects that are involved on salt lake systems, obviously unique to different areas.
So coming out of all of that, what should we be looking at for, I guess, good conservation for these ecosystems? Are there any good stories or bad stories, but success stories you'd like to share in relation to your experience in dealing with salt lakes and how proponents have managed them?
Yep. I think I mentioned Lake Kerry previously. I think that is an example of several companies that have been mining on the edge of that lake coming together with a common goal. They've got a vested interest in that lake system and making sure that they continue to manage ecological values. That has been going since 2000. Mm-hmm. It usually involves 3 to 5 companies, and it's very unique, I think, in Western Australia in that mining setting where that number of companies has come together with a common goal of making sure that they maintain and manage environmental values. I think that that really demonstrates that it can be done. And over the course of the last 20 years, we've been involved in a number of work packages to address key knowledge gaps on that lake. It's probably one of the most well-studied lake systems in the state, and the duration of those studies is quite unique as well.
Is that something you'd advocate for other lake systems where you've got multiple operations? I remember Lake Lefroy is a good example. Yep. There are a number of different operations coexisting on a large player.
Yep.
Would that work, do you think, for other lake systems?
Yeah, I think the model absolutely works, and I think it's not just for lake systems. I think it's for rivers as well.
Okay. And do you find that the proponents are willing to take on bad news when it comes to, from their perspective, having to curtail some of their operations or perhaps change how they would like to do certain things because of the potential or predicted impacts to the lake?
I think all of the companies we work with want to do the right thing. They're good environmental stewards, and I don't think it's necessarily this is bad news. I think it's how do we maintain those ecological values and how do we find options so that we can balance mining operations, for example, with the management of salt lake ecosystems. And I think that's where engineers have a part to play.
So beyond the ecology, which you deal with and I deal with obviously on a fairly regular basis, what other opportunities do the salt lakes offer? I mean, more than just the environmental principles, but science, technology, obviously there's a tourism aspect to it, or broader industry. You come across any examples?
Yeah, the Wheatbelt's a pretty good example. I mean, you've got lakes like Lake Dumble-Young, where you've got not only land speed records that have attempted to be broken, but also water speed records that were broken, I think, in the 60s. There's a range of salt lakes through the Wheatbelt that are used for skiing. Obviously, not that often at times. But yeah, they've got a range of different purposes and people living in those communities utilise them as such. Obviously, we've talked about salt lakes from a mining perspective and used as disposal sites for dewatering discharge. Also, mining of salts directly from those systems. And you touched on potash, particularly the saline groundwater, which may be conducive to being abstracted for potash purposes as well as a fertiliser.
And so how much do you get involved in with respect to the assessment of those particular uses? Is it something that is brought up and considered, or is it something that only happens on a sort of a when someone identifies that there's going to be a use?
Yeah, I'm probably not that involved in that side of things.
Yep.
Mainly just the ecology, but happy to provide an opinion.
Fair enough. So in your experience, if you had the choice to take listeners to one lake or one salt lake in Western Australia to show them something unforgettable or something absolutely remarkable about the systems, where would you take them and why?
Yeah, I would probably have to say Lake Mackay just because it's so big. You know, it's our lake air of WA. And I think you really don't get an appreciation for the size of these systems until you're there. You're standing on the edge of basically a huge inland sea. You really can't get an appreciation for these systems until you're in the air. Lake Mackay, for example, has some really interesting islands through the centre of the lake, some of which support bats because these island systems have cliffs and crevices. So it's really interesting, and that's in dry conditions. Wait till these systems get going in flooded conditions, and they are supporting thousands upon thousands of water birds.
And are they visited by tourists and ecologists on a regular basis, or is it something that people aren't really aware of?
I think probably a bit of both. I think there's some people that would be from country areas that find salt lakes quite fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But I think on the whole, particularly some of the larger systems in Central Australia might only be stumbled upon by people travelling around and trying to see the arid interior and then stumbling across a salt lake.
Okay, interesting. So for those people who do stumble across a salt lake or get something out of this podcast and want to go and have a look at these systems, how do they get involved in supporting or protecting these systems? Are there community groups that deal with salt lakes? Do they join a not-for-profit? What's out there?
Yeah, look, not a lot.
Okay.
In short, I think there's obviously local communities. We're talking about sort of Kalgoorlie earlier. We know that salt lakes are a big part of the Kalgoorlie and Goldfields area. Typically, the groups involved in managing and conserving salt lakes might be our government organisations like DBCA, where they're on reserves, or it will fall to proponents that might be having activities on the edges of these salt lakes. So I guess I would encourage people, if it's of interest, reach out to passionate scientists. As I mentioned, Angus before at Curtin, doing some great work on salt lakes. It's also a small community of salt lake ecologists like myself. I'm always happy to have a chat about salt lakes, working with students that might be studying salt lakes. So I would just reach out to experts in their field and get in touch, and they can link you up with the right people.
That's an interesting point. Are there people coming through universities who get involved in salt lakes? Is it an area that is studied or recognised as a bit of a growth area? Because it sounds like it's understudied and undervalued from an educational perspective.
Yeah, I think, as I said, Curtin is now doing some great work. Curtin was obviously where I studied back in the day. There was a bit of a gap, but I think there's a new wave of scientists coming through now that are getting engaged and getting involved in the study of salt lakes, plus all of the people in the consulting industry that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in mentoring. So those scientists are out there. They're just not that common.
No. And I think it's an area that warrants further study. And for me, it's always been an interesting one, tying sort of the mining side of things and the ecological values of salt lakes to the approvals process.
Yes.
And uncovering a whole suite of different dynamics and biological systems within that process that were previously people were unaware of. So I think it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, Andrew, is raising the awareness, making sure people understand that whilst they might look dry and barren, they actually are highly productive during flood, and they can be real hotspots for biodiversity irregularly. But when they flood, they are amazing systems.
Well, I think on that note, we might draw to a close. I really want to thank you for coming in. Fiona's is the only person I go and ask to for advice around salt lakes and has been for many, many years. So I really want to thank you for your time and patience. I know you're busy. And if anyone is interested in finding out a little bit more about salt lakes, please go and have a chat.
Yeah, welcome, and thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.